So on behalf of the team at EdFunders, I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for joining us for today's conversation, which is part 3 in our Future of Math series focused on classroom teaching. My name is Stephanie Waller, and I'm the program director at EdFunders. We also just want to thank the Gates Foundation for their generous sponsorship of the series, which began with an in-person session at EdFunders annual conference last fall and has continued to touch on a couple of different topics within the scope of the math world and what the future of math teaching and learning looks like. We're really excited to dig into today's discussion, and we really do encourage the discussion portion. So throughout the conversation today, please feel free to engage, share reflections, responses in the chat, and engage with each of our awesome panelists and presenters. And we really are honored to be joined by an all-star panel of experts for today's conversation. I'm really happy to introduce our 2 facilitators for today, Dr. Dave Kung and Dr. Eris Winger. Dave is a mathematician without borders, which is a title that I love, formerly a college professor, formerly with the Dana Center, who does deep work at the intersections of math teaching and learning. He also consults to organizations, including the philanthropic sector, around ensuring all students have access to high quality math experiences. And Dr. Eris Winger is also a mathematician by training, as well as assistant professor of mathematics at Georgia Gwinnett College. He's also the executive director of National Association of Mathematicians, working at the intersection and belonging in the math space. Dave and Eris, thank you so much for being here, and I will turn it over to you to get things.
Stephanie, thank you so much for having us here. I think I can speak for Eris there. I'm thrilled to be here. I think we're thrilled to be here. Are we thrilled to be here, Eris?
That is a fact.
Yeah. So we have gone through a couple of different iterations of this. We hope that I see some familiar faces. In person last October, we talked about some fantastic things, including just the need to sort of modernize the mathematics experience in so many ways to make sure it's more inclusive. And Eris, you were talking back in Atlanta back in October about all these narratives we really need to change. Yeah, you want to remind us what some of those narratives were?
Yeah, so the first thing is that thank you, Dave. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. The first thing is that mathematics is the greatest discipline in the history of people. Number one, right? And so we cannot have in our society that the fundamental belief that we all have that mathematics is so important, and yet person after person after person say they hate it, right? And so how is it that we need to change something, right? And so we have a belief that in order to change cultures, we need to change the narratives that are dominating, that the culture abides by. And so some of these narratives we had a chance to talk about in Atlanta, as Dave said, about speed, about, in other words, how fast you do it means how smart you are, about getting correctness, right? Getting to the answer. Unless you get the answer, nothing else matters. And about content knowledge in general. And so we talked about some of those and really thinking about that the future of our discipline and the future of everyone being engaged in mathematics is tied to calling those narratives into question, creating counter narratives, and moving everybody forward.
Yeah, that's so important. And part of one of those narratives we have, at least in the US right now, is the preeminence of calculus as this goal in the high school math space, especially. Even though, calculus is wonderful, I always feel like I need a disclaimer in here. I love calculus. I've taught it many times. It's fantastic. And it is exactly the math you need for some futures. And but there's a broad range of mathematics, and some of the other mathematics that's out there is becoming more and more important in this age of data. That's what we talked about in one of the earlier sessions. All these sessions are on YouTube, so if you missed one of those early ones, please go look them up on YouTube. Today we're going to get into questioning some other parts of the educational system. I think I think this is the sort of system you went through, Eris, right? In fact, I get to see your old high school at Dunbar up in DC all the time, right? And so it is you have a math class, it meets 180 days, like you have that one topic that year, right? And you do that and you get a grade and then you move on to the next one. And like through that 180 days, you have one teacher out there who, if you were lucky, is like certified and well paid and all of that. And that whole framing of the mathematics education experience is something that the folks have been calling into question increasingly. And I'm really excited for this conversation because we have three people on here who are really fantastic and have done work exactly in this space of rethinking some of these parts of our education system. So should we introduce everybody?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So Shelby Cole, Shelby, it's coming to us from Florida. It's great to see you. Shelby was a high school math teacher. She worked for state agencies. Shelby's been everywhere. She's done a million things. She worked at Smarter Balanced, and now she's at Student Achievement Partners. She no longer has the title that she wants to, but we're just going to go with your old title and call you designer. Can we do that? And if you're curious, you have to look her up somewhere else to find out what her current title is. Um, Shelby, welcome. We're thrilled to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
We've got Joel Rose on the line. Joel Rose did Teach for America down in Houston. He worked for the New York City Public Schools. He founded a group called New Classrooms that does work that we'll hear about more in a little bit. Joel is actually coming to us from, I forget, which airport are you in?
I'm in Seattle.
Excellent. And so Joel's gonna, I think Joel might go on and off mic so that we don't hear all the announcements in Seattle for where various planes are going. Joel, it's great to have you here. Thanks for joining us. And I'm thrilled to have my friend Trina Wilkerson here, who spent many years, we won't name how many, Trina, many years as a high school math teacher in Louisiana, works now at Baylor in the School of Ed. And my condolences for currently serving as chair of a department of curriculum instruction. Many of us have been there and done that, and have moved on. So thanks for your service there. But I hope that's going all right. Good to see you here, Trina.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here and looking forward to our discussions, conversations, and chats.
That's great. So we're going to talk about some of these assumptions built into the educational system, especially in mathematics. We're going to talk a lot about high school mathematics, but it's not exclusively high school. A lot of these issues apply in places outside of that. But Shelby, I want to come to you first because this sort of being tied to year-long sequences, sort of year-long courses. Like you take a course, you get a grade for that course. And then, if you're lucky, you move on. If you're not lucky, if you had a bad teacher, you had problems that year, you don't move on from that, and you get to take that course again the next year. That's something that's sort of deeply embedded in our consciousness. It's I don't know. It's even in the labels we use for these courses. And we sort of think it's obvious. It's so embedded in the history of mathematics education, at least the recent history, that it's algebra, geometry, algebra 2. Each one of these is a course. You're part of an effort that's starting to question that and to try to change that paradigm. Can you talk us through the work that you're doing there?
Yeah, in fact, when you said the 180 days at the beginning, I get anxiety because it's been like that for so long. We are so slow to challenge things and actually replace them, even though we have all the capacity to do so. But I want to just share with folks a quick history of why I'm no longer in the best job on the planet, which is teaching high school math. And that is because I was teaching in a school where 50% of our children were entering high school in pre-algebra. And this was back in 2003. And what that meant was that they were only going to get to geometry before the year where many of them had to still take ACT, SAT in order to gain admissions into higher ed institutions. And so after noticing that these students were disproportionately Black and brown, and I do not use that phrase lightly, but that is what was visible, right? If I looked into a classroom in the school that I taught, I could predict the name of the course based on who was sitting there. And so I didn't stay in teaching very long because I couldn't be complicit in that system and just watch this happen. And so I was frantically moving kids out of pre-algebra into algebra 1 to make sure that they had opportunities to do all of the things that they wanted to after high school. So I left and I studied this issue of really looking at course taking trends and what was going on there. And I'm really happy now, in many years later, to have this come full circle and have the opportunity to really think about the issue of high school mathematics and what can we actually do to begin to make substantial change. And so in December of 2021, Jason Zimba, who is one of the co-founders of our organization, Student Achievement Partners, had partnered with XQ Institute, and XQ is really rethinking and reimagining what high school mathematics looks like and starting to challenge things like those you named, Dave. Like, how can we really rethink things like seat time and number of days and start to really use some of the flexibilities that the current technology, and if we start to eliminate barriers and structures, there are a lot of opportunities for us to change what education looks like. And so Jason had designed what were the beginning of what we now call the high school math badging framework. And this is essentially a way for us to credential student learning at a grain size that is much smaller than a course, more comparable to what we might call an instructional unit. And really thinking about how to do that from a competency-based approach. So taking those smaller units of mathematics and trying to describe the learning and what the competencies are. And in many ways for students, they feel much more manageable, right? It's much different than saying you have to learn all of Algebra 1. And if you're not successful, which in many places 40% and over are not successful the first time, it feels much more manageable. And what we did with the system is we didn't write in a way for kids to fail. In a competency-based system, it can only be true that you haven't yet met the expectations. And so we've been designing the system, and even though people are putting it still into a system where children may not be successful, the potential for the future is that we will have a much more flexible system where it can only be true that a student has either met the expectations for a badge or not yet met the expectations for a badge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is so important. Eris, you spend some time in classrooms, and I always think that there's this disconnect between teachers talking about like growth mindset. We all have to have this growth mindset. Also, your grade is based on one test that you do once.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And it can be demoralizing for sure.
Yeah, for lots of kids. Joel, I know you've done work in a similar way. Like, tell us your take on similar issues.
Sure. Well, I wanted to start off by kind of grounding us in the hard reality of where we are nationally with math, which is before the pandemic, only 1 in 3 kids graduated high school ready for college or career in math. And now that number is 1 in 4. So our view is we need to start thinking very differently about how we teach kids math. And for us, that begins by actually getting down to the skill level. When I say skill, I mean the procedural, the conceptual, and the applied. There are roughly, from the time a student gets past basic numeracy, there are roughly 300 skills they need to learn to be through Algebra 1. Everything from the Pythagorean theorem to two-step equations to area of a parallelogram. If a student walks into 5th grade knowing none of those, which is quite rare, but certainly possible, they can learn 1 a week and master all 300 before they graduate. 1 a week is a crazy slow pace. So why isn't only 1 in 4 students actually hitting this bar? And it's because we constantly have this mismatch between grade levels and math. Math being cumulative, grade levels being sequential. I'm a former teacher. I taught 5th grade. My job was to teach these 45 skills to the 11-year-olds in my class. Didn't matter if they had the predecessor knowledge to learn those or if they could move beyond. My job was only to teach those 45 skills. If we ever want to kind of move to a whole new place with math education, this conflict between skills being cumulative in math and grade levels being sequential based on age, that in the past, grade level always wins in that conflict. We needed math to win. And what that means is moving toward a model where there's personalized competency-based learning, where we say to a student who walks into the 5th grade, welcome to 5th grade. There's 300 math topics you're going to learn. It may take you 3 years, it may take you 4, it may take you 5. We're going to get you there as fast as we can, be with you every step of the way, but we are here to help you get to where you need to get to. So what our nonprofit does is really help schools that want to begin on that path by providing very precise diagnostic assessments. So you know if you're the 7th grade teacher, where each of your student is situated relative to the 7th grade skills and all of their unique predecessor skills. We give them content, some teacher-led, some digital, some collaborative, so they can learn those skills. Very rigorous assessments to measure skill level mastery. And because those assessments are so rigorous, it's now a near certainty that if they do learn all of the skills on their personalized roadmap, they'll be proficient on their state assessment. So really helping schools begin to make this transition to personalized competency-based learning.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Joel. Like one of these things that was embedded in both Shelby and Joel, what you're saying is something that I think Trina knows a lot about. But like the current situation in a lot of math just has an incredibly long list of skills. And I want to highlight two things in there. One is just the length. I think we were talking when we were on the prep call for this that like there's some unnamed state that has like 257 different different skills that you need to
Standards, yeah.
yeah. And so one is just the length of that, but two is that is that they're really couched in skills, right? And and Trina, when you were at NCTM has done fantastic work sort of trying to broaden our perspective from like computational skills to sort of to ideas more broadly. Can you talk about sort of the distinction that we were trying to make there?
It's interesting you use the word broaden, because one of the key recommendations from NCTM has us thinking about broadening the purposes of mathematics and what it is and how we use it and why we use it and what's really important. And I think one of those things to maybe move away from those 257 different discrete things that we need to learn. Not that I don't love doing those things. You can name any of them and I love doing them. The bigger idea is, what are the essential concepts, the big ideas in mathematics? For example, many know that in the middle school area, proportional reasoning is essential. It is one of the key areas that's taught during that kind of grade band time. But you also have to pay attention to what is it before that happens, that in order to build that, and then what's coming after. And so that kind of gets at what Joel is talking about as well. Our students come in, whatever grade, if you're in a graded school, whatever grade level you're in, every student is not in the same place. So you have this list of things you're supposed to teach, but yet you need to be able to do those grade level. But there's students that are having issues that are things that they don't understand in foundational areas. And so I think if we look at it through big ideas, big concepts, and think of that instead of tiny discrete areas, we can think about ways to actually teach and connect. That's the other big word I love, is connecting mathematics. Mathematics should make sense, and it connects. You're not learning individual things, you're learning things that connect to one another. So we broaden the purpose of mathematics, we think about those connections and think about those big ideas that are important for students. And Joel, to go back to what you were talking about with the all these the different ways that y'all are approaching it to help teachers, I think that's another important piece of this, is we need to help all of us to understand, teachers included, about how to scaffold and support students in areas that maybe they're supposed to be learning this, but there's some things before that they need to work on. And you can't really go grade to a fourth grader. Instead, you start with your fourth grade and then you figure out and work with them individually and scaffold. But that is a lot to ask a teacher to do. And there's a lot of skills and a lot of strategies that teachers need in order to be able to do that.
No, I am so excited about this. So one of the reasons why I was happy to be here with you all, as I always am with this group, is the diversity and the fact that people are coming from different places, and that we can come together and really start to think about where our commonalities are and how we see a common vision forward. What I've heard from each of you has been this theme of every student is not the same, right? That each of you at some point has said that every student is on their own path. And yet, to Trina's point, there's one teacher, there's us standing in front of 30 people who are all in a different place, right? And so this is this feels impossible. I was encouraged and given hope by Shelby just a few moments ago when she said that there's flexibility, there's capacity. I'm going to ask people in the chat, everybody on this call, about, how is it now? Because all three of you have talked about being able to attend to the individual. How is it pragmatically going to work for one of us to be sitting in front of 29 to 30 people and attend individually to each of them? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a hard question. And just to piggyback on that, like, how do you get the interaction that we know is so important among students? And how do you, like, there's tension there between wanting students to be in the same place and wanting them to be working on similar things, and also wanting to reach their individual needs. Yeah.
Can I take a pass at that?
Yeah, please.
I think it's one word, and the word is modalities. When schools were first created, they created on this belief that the only way a child could learn something new was from a teacher. We know that is no longer true. Students can learn from each other, from teachers, independently, with technology. And when you think about all of these modalities, the burden is now not on the teacher to do all the teaching. There is no way a teacher can possibly diagnose every student's specific pre-grade learning gaps, on-grade learning gaps, and address them. But when you think about other modalities and integrating them into the student experience, it's far more possible. In the absence of that, the problem continues to get worse. I'll give you one statistic, kind of building on the earlier point. If a child is trying to learn the Pythagorean theorem, remember a squared plus b squared equals c squared? Two primary predecessor skills, understanding exponents and classifying triangles. If you don't have knowledge of those predecessor skills, you have less than a 30% chance of learning the Pythagorean theorem. If you do have knowledge of those predecessor skills, you have a 72% chance of learning the Pythagorean theorem. That's how game-changing it can be to use these modalities to support addressing each student's individual needs.
But I want to say super fast that, I'm big on narratives. So I presented a hidden narrative that I was not thinking about. And it's the narrative that it is the teacher and only the teacher in which our students can get information from. I just wanted to call that out, that you are inherently challenging that narrative, that it's the teacher that is the only one who can convey knowledge. And that's what we have to call into question. I appreciate that. Shelby, you were going to say?
So what's interesting is that as part of this work, we interviewed a first grade teacher, and she's been trained in cognitively guided instruction. And what you learn from kindergarten and first grade teachers is they don't really have a choice, right? They don't have a lot of ways to get information from children other than talking to the children. And so anybody that I work with, I always recommend that you spend like as much time as possible, right? We can't have the teacher up at the center all the time. Spend as much time as possible talking to individual kids, because with what we're hearing with our work even right now is that some of the information that gets thrown away is what students say, right? We want everything in writing. We want everything to be filled in some bubble sheet. And yet a lot of valuable information is actually in what children communicate to us orally. And so we need better systems and better guidance for how to take everything that we're comprehensively learning about what children know and understand, and being able to use that toward really thinking about whether they've sort of met the requirements for whatever unit happens to be.
And may I build on that just a little bit, Shelby?
Please.
I think another piece of that you are talking about here is that recently I was working with some teachers and administrators, and the term intentionally listening, being intentional about your listening. And so providing a space where students can discuss, can work on things together, can dialogue together, can learn from each other. And even if they are working on different kinds of tasks, or they're at different levels, they're in different backgrounds, prior knowledge, they still have some tasks and things that they can work on. But there's an intentionality that a teacher has to develop in listening to students as they talk. And the thing that was brought up about that as well is we need to help students to learn to intentionally listen as well. And then what do you do with what you've heard? What do you do with that to help further the discussion, the learning, et cetera?
That's so important. I love this idea of listening, and I loved all this discussion of sort of deep learning and thinking deeply about the material and how it's connected. But I mean, all of you are former high school teachers, and like, that there are pressures on every teacher out there that they actually work against these ideas of sort of deep learning and things like that. And I wanted to just give you a chance to sort of to help this group understand the pressures that are on teachers that actually make it kind of reasonable for them to say, like, oh, I'm just going to teach you this trick, right? As opposed to like, I'm going to deeply tie this material back to previous things and foreshadow where this is going. I'm just going to tell you this trick, right? And that'll get you through Friday's quiz, or that'll make sure that you meet the benchmark on the state test that you're taking next week. Can you talk a little bit about the sort of structural and policy decisions we've collectively made that like fight against teachers having the freedom to teach in the ways that we're talking about?
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point. Within public schools, legislators dictate a lot of what is happening and the policies that are there, and whether a classroom teacher, an administrator, a school district, or family understands those and wants to support them, is not always up for debate. Once it gets enacted, you have to abide by things like the 180 days. There are certain days you have to be there, certain number of days. There's a time frame. There are certain 257 different things that we have to check off that we are teaching. Also time on task. There's just a number of things. And teachers will tell me, and I had this experience as well, there just doesn't seem to be enough time in the day. And so one of the things that I think is really important, and this came out of some of the NCTM work when we're thinking about these recommendations for catalyzing change, and it had the idea of we need to bring policymakers and decision makers, administrators, school boards, all those into this conversation so that they understand the reality of what, not the reality of just what is right now, but what the future reality could be and what it should be so that all students have access to mathematics in powerful ways.
Yeah.
Toby and Joel, yeah, please jump in.
One thing that I've been saying lately is that adults and children deserve to be in spaces where they can grow and thrive. And teaching is a really unsupported profession, right? So when you leave your teacher prep program, you've often had one methods course and you're certified now in teaching 7 to 12 math, which it makes sense that teachers would revert back to however they learned math because we don't have anything else. And if you don't have the support to continue to develop your content knowledge that helps you do all of the things that we just talked about earlier, which is be responsive to where students are coming from. What we've been learning, we didn't actually expect badging. Badging was designed for students, right? It was credentialing student learning. And what we found is that it actually provides a really nice structure for thinking about teacher professional learning. So we've been doing badge level professional learning communities with teachers across states. And by creating spaces where teachers are allowed to show up and be vulnerable and admit that they don't know things, taking the pretentiousness out of math for a little while, we're actually uncovering spaces where we can really dig deeply into the content so that teachers can then go back and do a better job of feeling confident that they can work with students on learning the things that they themselves didn't get to learn sufficiently to be in classrooms teaching them.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I would add, Dave, what I think are the kind of the three barriers to the type of learning you're talking about. One is if I'm a high school algebra teacher, I've got to cover a certain number of topics by the end of the year, and they barely fit. So if I want to spend 3 days going deep on a particular topic, that time's got to come from somewhere else, and then make it harder for me to actually get through everything I've got to get through. So I'm going to be disincentivized to do that. The second is, even if I do want to go deep on 2 or 3 topics, there's a big planning burden. What are those topics? How are they going to get connected? What's the project I'm going to figure out? What if kids are absent? What if some kids don't want to engage? Like, it's just a much bigger headache for a teacher to go through the planning rather than just sort of covering a particular topic or skill. And then the third is, what is my school accountable for? If I'm a high school teacher, graduation. Kids have to pass in many states the high school test. And that's the main metric that policymakers are looking at. So I'd rather give them this trick so I can move on to the other topics so they pass the test than actually spend 4 days kind of going into why this topic exists to begin with.
Yeah, I think that's such a conundrum, like that it is actually more efficient. They will be quicker at getting the right answer if you teach them this trick. It will also be worse for them in the long run. And so, I mean, you have that trade-off that you have to make as a teacher. Like, this is better for them. I know it's going to be harder in the near term, but it'll be better for them to learn something deeper.
Well, and I guess I've learned something. So I'm struggling with attention, and there's a great comment in the chat we may want to address also. But I am struggling with, wanting to make change because in the last couple of days, in this moment and yesterday getting ready for this moment, I've heard 257, I've heard 300, and then I just heard lovingly that we can barely do it. And so I would like to say that we can't do it. And not that we can't, I would like to say we should not try to fit 300. I don't care if they're topic, standard, skill. Like, if we got 180 days, and we can call the 180 in the question. So, but if we fix 180, then how can we possibly be talking about 257, 300, 5,000? Like, Like, can we just address the fact that, so I'm just trying to figure out this community I'm with right now, how are we on this number? Are we saying we can do it? It's too much, it's way too much, it's a little too much, it's fine? What are we thinking about these numbers that are in the hundreds when we don't have days that are in the hundreds? It's 180 days.
Well,
Maybe
just
it's
to be
not
clear
the
on
right things. Oops, sorry, Joel.
That's okay. Well, just in our case, the 300 spans 5th through 8th grade. So it's supposed to be about 50 a year at the
Got
skill level, which is a little more doable. But I think there is a broader question, which is what happens when kids fall far behind. So if I'm going into the 6th grade and I'm on a 3rd grade level, right now the presumption is somehow the teacher is going to magically teach 6 years worth of stuff in 3 years. That's not going to happen. And the expectation that that will happen, schools try to do that and it never works, and kids fall further and further behind. So I do think we don't want kids to fall behind to begin with, of course. But when that happens, for whatever reason, there are some hard questions we have to answer. So for example, if we have to prune, if we have to take some skills and kind of like not focus on them, maybe we focus just on the ones that relate to algebra. And maybe maybe box and whisker plots is not like essential for this particular student when they graduate 8th grade. Or let's at least finish all things algebra before we sort of cover some of these other topics. Those conversations about kind of pruning the skills for students who are behind to set them up for success is one that most states and districts never have.
The trend.
And I love box and whisker plots.
Yeah. The trend is away from 257 standards. And so we've seen Oregon, who did their 2+1 model in high school, take a significant slashing to the high school standards. I think they landed with 14 geometry standards. I'm not sure how many in the other domains, but really identifying the core content that they wanted all students to have in the first 2 years of high school. And they did that in conjunction with higher education. So they weren't like cutting things out and setting students up for failure. They made sure that the opportunities that their higher ed institutions were offering were still available to students. So students can go on these pathways and they can enter in courses. It's just that that first credit bearing course no longer has to be college algebra for every student. And that is a change that is very recent, just within the last 15 years. Because when I did the cut scores for Smarter Balance, guess what? The only class that most places were offering was either college algebra or calculus, and we've seen that shift. So I think that shift allows us to start to think about what I would love to see happen, which is to broaden. Right now, state policy says you need X math credits and you need Y science credits. And we know that STEM has a TE, so we'll throw in some electives here. But what if we started talking about a healthy STEM portfolio and stopped trying to argue everything into math, right? There are a lot of really cool disciplines that use math, but we're spending all of our time fighting, trying to get them into math because that's what the state policy says. Instead of saying, like, how do we start to create a healthy STEM portfolio where we still identify core content, and it's a lot less than 257 standards at the high school level. Like, let's really identify what's core, but then start to build in the flexibility that our children deserve based on the careers and the future opportunities that exist in 2024 and beyond. It's state policy. It can be very restrictive, and it keeps us having the same conversations. And we're fighting right now. We're fighting about whether something is or is not math, even though we all say it's good for kids. In both sides, you see, this is a great thing for kids. But we can't be convinced that it's mathy enough, right? So stop, right? Let's change the policy at the state level and start having conversations about what's best for kids.
There's so much to unpack in all of this, and so many great comments here. I think it's Liza or Lisa, but made a comment in chat that relates to NCTM language, right? So the difference between math practices standards versus math content standards. I'm sure not everybody on this call knows the difference. Can you, Trina, can you help us unpack this NCTM language?
Well, one of the things, and I appreciate so much for sharing that, content is one of the things that Shelby just said that we keep fighting about. but there are many who talk about what do students really need to know for the future. If you think about kindergartners coming in class now, what is it, the jobs that they're going to be doing, the careers they're going to go into, we can't even imagine what they will be. So what are those mathematical practices, mathematical processes, and just practices and processes in general, like problem solving, being able to think critically about things and analyze data, for example, being able to critique your thinking and being able to analyze that. So there are a lot of things around that that are really important, that are mathematical practices and processes that are not specific to one piece of content. They're true across the board. So while, can students persevere? Can they engage in problem solving in a way that if they get stuck, they continue working? Or earlier, we talked about if they're making mistakes, can they learn from those and persevere and be persistent and continue to move forward in their learning, and that they're okay with that? So those are some of the things that she's talking about, and very important. I think that often we leave those behind in our infighting about we want this in the curriculum in the mathematics and this content and this little piece. Instead, also think about what are those processes that we want all students to have.
So important. And like embedded in, like when you're thinking of it as about skills, one of the things that comes up if you're thinking about it as skills is that there's like you're either right or you're wrong, right? And this obsession with correctness, Eris, that's something we talked about back last October in Atlanta. And Shelby, you were talking about that when we were talking in preparation for this. Can you talk about this, just the over focus that we have on correctness and how that plays out for students and as part of the culture?
Sure. Yeah. I was actually in a conversation yesterday where this message did not land well, right? Because, and it's fair that it doesn't land well, because we've created a system where what is still valued on assessments, which still drive a lot of what happens, is right or wrong, right? We are still evaluating children's learning based on whether they got correct answers or not. And I've worked in the assessment space, so I happen to know that we are likely getting a lot of bad information, because the one bad move away from multiple choice to these other item types is there's a lot more ways to get them wrong, right? So as long as we are valuing correct versus incorrect and not looking at the full breadth of what students are bringing to us, we're actually not doing a great job of measuring what it is that the standards ask children to do. We have to start looking at the work that children are producing, at listening to children, because these assessments that we're using that are driving everything that happens in classrooms, unfortunately, still value right or wrong when they produce a score. And what I would also just add one more thing about assessments, since I worked in it for several years, I don't believe that in 2024, you can actually get a good measure of student learning when the first thing that you do is lock children out of the world that you pretend that you're preparing them for, right? So in a secure testing platform, it locks out everything that children normally have access to, whether it's mathematical tools, whether it's accommodations, whether it's translation supports. We take a lot of that away. And so are they using appropriate tools strategically? We can't measure that once we've locked them out of everything that they're used to using. So I think we want to move away from correctness toward really looking at students' brilliance and what they're bringing, but we aren't positioned to do it until we fully address the fact that we're still evaluating learning using tests that are delivered in secure testing platforms.
Can I ask a question, Shelby, just on that one, which is, I hear what you're saying, but in a world in which we're looking at things like student work and more sort of subjective perspectives from teachers, how do we ensure equitable learning environments? How do we make sure that there aren't different standards and different experiences for different kids? Because if nothing else, as flawed as these assessments may be, they do give us a clear and accurate norm picture of learning across different communities.
I mean, they give a picture. Whether it's clear and accurate. I had students who were scoring level 1 on an assessment that they should have been getting a level 5 on, because they had come from the Dominican Republic, because we have a system that requires them to take a test. Almost every multilingual learner that I got at East Hartford High School was misplaced because of an assessment. They should have been 2 years above in mathematics in some cases. So I don't know that we're necessarily getting a clear and accurate picture. we are getting a picture that we feel is standardized. It's true that they all sat through the same test, but I think if we actually want to talk about equity, we have to get serious about what these tests are not measuring. And it's not measuring a lot of the brilliance and beauty that our children are bringing.
I want to pivot if we can. We're a good 40 minutes into this, and we've mentioned teachers a few times, but and I love the fact that we've been focused mostly on students, but teachers play a huge role. And if you've been reading the news and the education presses about teachers, you know that there's a teacher shortage. You know that the teachers tend to be a little bit demoralized. I was reading this piece this morning about teachers actually, as part of their negotiating process for the unions, they're trying to get school districts to clamp down on cell phones, right? They're trying to get school districts to make that decision so that they don't have to fight it at the classroom level. Teachers are really struggling. I'm in classes these days watching this. And Trina, you've been doing some work for CBMS, the Conference Board of the Mathematical Sciences, to dive into this, the status of the teaching profession and where we stand in terms of shortages. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found in your work there?
I'd be happy to. And it's interesting. We've heard and we read headlines all the time about the teacher shortage and that everybody's leaving the teaching profession, particularly since COVID. And we hear a lot of anecdotal stories about it, which are very important because that humanizes the problem. But the question that CBMS wanted to know is what is the real picture and what does it really mean? And how can we take this and think about what the future might be and how we might support teachers? Because teachers are being asked to do a lot, but are teachers staying in the profession? And why? If they are, why? If they are not, why not? We were talking about, Eric, you were talking about numbers that have keep popping out. I have numbers like, I was going to put it in the chat box. I've got a 55,000 to talk about, and I got a 47 out of 50 to talk about. One of the studies that we found that there were 55,000 vacancies in 21-22 for teaching mathematics. And that's a lot.
Wow.
Okay. All right. And there was another one that found that 47 of 50 states did report shortages in elementary, middle school, and secondary math teachers for 2022-2023. So that's recently, like post-COVID. And so it is a real thing. And it's a really important thing. We also find that there are far less students going into teacher education, and of the students who do go into teacher ed, say at the beginning of their program, their college time, there's a larger percentage now that are not completing it. So we have a lot of teachers who are in the classrooms who are not credentialed, who don't have that background. And I will tell you, I tell people this all the time, they get upset because there's an uncertified teacher in a classroom. But I tell them, I say, an administrator, when school starts, there has to be someone in that classroom. Okay. And so the question then becomes, how are we going to support who's in that classroom? Which goes back to a lot of what Shelby and Joel were talking about. We have to find ways to help support teachers in this. So there are also a lot of growing numbers of various types of credentialing programs. And some of them are successful, some are not. We do find that there are higher percentages of teachers leaving the profession that went through some alternate certification programs. That's not to say that some aren't successful, but there are many that there's a higher rate of attrition. And that is one of the areas that we are also looking at. One of the interesting ones is also thinking about, we'd heard a lot about teachers of color that are at highest risk. And one of the things that we found out is that in many states, teachers of colors have a lower retention rate, but there are exceptions. For example, in Texas, Hispanic teachers have the highest retention rate. Okay, over a 10-year period, 60%, Black teachers, 50%, and white teachers, about 45% over a 10-year period. But it depends on where you are geographically. There's socioeconomic status that has to be thought about in this, impoverished areas. We found that it differs depending on urban, suburban, rural. That's another area. And we've also found that it's within a state, not just one state versus another, but within a state, you can have extremely high shortages in certain parts of the state, but not in other parts. And so I think what we have is an issue that we need to think more about. What do we need to do to support teachers in their becoming credentialed, but then how do we continue to support them? All right. And that's retaining them. And so if we have time, I can talk about promising practices, because that's another thing we've been looking at. And there are several out there that that are important for us to think about. But I think we have a real problem. It'd be great to hear from Joel and Shelby and everyone about, where do you see us going for the future with this? We know that it is a true problem, but how are we going to support teachers?
I actually would go even a step before that, which is, how do we redesign the role of the teacher? I mean, imagine you're a ninth grade teacher today, ninth grade algebra teacher. You've got kids coming into your class on a 6th and 7th grade level. You've got 20, 30% attendance, some behavior issues. You're told you have to now teach the grade level curriculum. You're accountable for the results. This is not an attractive job. So when we talk about redesigning the classroom and using these modalities, it's not just to make it possible to address individual students' needs. It's also about redesigning the role of the teacher so the job is more sustainable. We've got teachers leaving in droves, not choosing to go into this profession. And we've had the same paradigm of how school is organized for over 100 years. We know how it works. It's designed so that it really winnows out most kids and only serves 20 to 30% at the end of the day. So I think these efforts to really kind of rethink the design of the classroom and rethink the role of the teacher really needs to be central to how we move the dial for both teachers and students.
And I would go back to this idea that mathematics spaces themselves have to be less pretentious. They have to look accessible. They have to look like people belong here. And right now that's not the case. And so if you give me folks who want to work in a community, who love the children in that community, and you send them to me for the summer, I will give you some Algebra 1 teachers, right? But we have created a space where mathematics is held in such high regard. We believe that's not possible. We believe that only certain people can achieve in mathematics. And so when we don't get math teachers, guess what? It's because of the space we've created. It's because of the prestige of math, and people don't want to be in it. So my thing is back to, we need to create spaces where adults and children can grow and thrive. And when you create those spaces, when you create loving community, when people feel supported, guess what? They'll want to teach, but that's not the environment that exists for people out there.
Can you all talk a little bit about what kind of professional development you would like to see more of, to prepare teachers to do the kinds of things that we're talking about, to teach the broad range of math, to see the sort of strands of thinking that extend, from elementary all the way through? What's the professional development that you've seen that does that?
It's co-planning. So we have this thing in badging that is our 7 learning principles, and we bring teachers together and they take what is just a math task and they talk about, how do I take these 7 learning principles and bring the task, make the task into a learning experience, something that deserves students' time and attention. And so teachers will work together on that, and then they come back together and they talk about what students did. So we have to build a supportive system that allows teachers to have real conversations, that allows them to try things, that allows them to get things wrong and come back and admit it. And if we can create structures around teaching that position teachers as learners of the mathematics and not people that have to go in knowing everything, I believe we'll be much more successful at retaining folks.
And Shelby, if I can build on that, I think that it also connects to policy. The way there are different policies in place of going back to that 180 days, there are also a certain number of minutes you have to be in the classroom, et cetera. And I think one of the things we need to rethink is that structure as well. Teachers need time to do what you're talking about within their workday, not something they have to do on Saturday or they have to do, at 6 o'clock at night. Instead, it's part of the work that they do because it contributes to them being able to meet the needs of their students in their classroom. It also builds community. It also builds their own identity and authority and agency, et cetera. So I think that's a really important part of this, is for us to have those conversations with those that are making these kinds of policies and practices that are put structures in place that actually inhibit teachers being able to work together in the ways you're talking about.
Look, as a former teacher, I benefited from great professional development and helped me become a better teacher, like many teachers. And I could only be but so successful in the context of one teacher and 30 kids in a room. So I'm a bit skeptical about sort of how much value can we get from PD within the current classroom structure? How do we think differently about the classroom structure and then provide PD in ways that help teachers to be successful in that environment? So for example, in the schools that we work with, a lot of the PD we provide are about things like, one, teaching kids how to become independent learners. Two, how do you group kids who have common needs at a particular time so you can support instruction for them? Three, how to use data to diagnose specific individual misconceptions so students can accelerate. All of this is happening within a different vision for how the classroom operates, as opposed to trying to optimize the current vision that itself is so limited.
Thanks, Joel.
Yeah, and there's a comment in the chat just about leveraging and supporting co and paraprofessionals. And I know that there have been attempts in many cities that are facing teacher shortages to actually help people become certified who are already in the education space in some capacity. And even some of those efforts are actually hitting state level policy barriers, right? They're like, oh, well, you didn't have a C+ average in 8th grade, so sorry, right? So I think that there's a lot of potential there, but it's like everything else in education where there's some reason why we can't, even though it's a great idea.
Good point. And I love also that one of our participants mentioned about engaging students in this. They are part of this as well. And their voice is important in all of this. It's it shouldn't be us doing things to students, but teachers and students and everyone working together and their voice being heard. And Shelby, you were talking about there are a lot of different programs out there that people are trying, like teacher residency programs, mentoring induction type programs, partnerships, grow your own, those kind of things. But you're right, some of them meet with some various barriers. And that's something that we've got to look at. We've got to be more we've got to think more carefully about ways that we can engage people in wanting to learn to teach and wanting to engage in teaching mathematics is what we're talking about, but to also stay there. And how are we going to support them rather than saying, oh, you didn't do this, we're going to check you off, you can't be a part of this anymore. But instead, how do we bring them all in as potential teachers that not only love kids, but they love what they're teaching and they want all students to learn.
Thanks. We only have a couple minutes left here, but I do want to go back to a point that Trina you made, which is about alternative certification. Like in a lot of places, teachers are bringing in via alternative certifications to to fill holes, to make sure there's, as Shelby was saying, a warm body in the classroom. What do you see in that space in terms of that's working? What do you see that's not working? And I mean, I know alternative cert teachers come in lots of different flavors, and some of them are doing fantastic work and others of them are really struggling, but there's a diversity there. What are you seeing?
Well, and to really highlight what you just said, there are some very promising and very strong alternate certification type programs, but there are also, the reality is that there are a lot of those teachers that go through those programs that don't stay in teaching. And there are a variety of reasons. Some of that has to do with maybe not having, they did just a 1-year program. They didn't have much experience in the classroom. They don't know all the different ways to address motivation or working with students and how do you engage students in conversation, or they don't have all of the different content background and understanding that they might need to teach. And so I think that is one of the things that I've seen in several of the programs that we've been reading about and have talked with people, is this mentoring them and working with them for the first 1 to 5 years, is that we don't just throw them into the classroom, but we are there. And when I say we, that there's a team supporting them. So and their partnership programs with the school itself, but also statewide, we found some agencies that are actually working on that as well. So I think that we need to do that. And it goes to exactly what we were saying about students, not all being in the same place and knowing the same thing. Same thing with us as teachers. We're not all in the same place. We have different areas that we need to grow in. And so we need to be able to work with teachers individually and collectively and support them in moving forward. And I think alternate certification, or any teacher that graduates from gets a certification, they need continued support.
Thanks, Trina. Just a last thought from each of you. What are you seeing out there that's got you really optimistic? Like what are you seeing that are like that is really exciting? I want to see more of that.
I'll give you one example with some work we're doing with AI. So one of the challenges we've always had in the past is everyone says, make math relevant, make math relevant, make math relevant. the reality is in an individual class, what's relevant and interesting to one student isn't to another. One student likes cooking or art or sports or music, and it's really hard for any one teacher to somehow make math relevant to every student in a class at all times. But we started to use generative AI. So for each one of the skills in our program, we have the when will I use this button. And so if you like sports or cooking or music or photography, you know, two-step equations, here's where two-step equations are used in all these different areas. And then students can kind of put where they find interesting or boring. And we're learning more and more about what students find relevant. And then over time can help shape their experience around those interests. So that's just one way what we and other organizations are using AI to help accelerate math.
Thanks, Shelby.
That's really fun, Joel. So I think my favorite part of all of this has been talking to students, right? So I went into a classroom in Idaho, and for these children who are in 11th grade who hadn't been successful in mathematics, I went in and I talked to them, and this was early in the school year, and I asked them, what's your favorite math problem that you've done so far this year? And they had one, right? So they had a favorite math problem. And there was this story recently, one of our badging teachers actually took her students who are in an alternative high school, and they were learning one variable measurement data. They went out to the most dangerous or to the intersections within the town that they live, and they collected data on how dangerous those intersections were. They presented those data to the mayor and chief of police. And just last week, or there was an update on this story where the mayor had come back to them, gone through the list of suggestions they had made, and said which ones they were going to be able to implement and which ones were, as we're talking about here, blocked by some policy barrier. But he did follow up, and it was just really cool to see children who have had 10 years of hating math actually out there doing really important high school math and seeing action taken based on it. So that's been my favorite part. That's giving me a lot of hope.
Love that. Trina, really quick.
Real quick, I am very hopeful about who is being brought into the conversation and is wanting to have a conversation about where education should go for the future in mathematics. And I know NCTM started with thinking about these critical conversations, but I believe now we have pockets that are having those critical conversations and moving forward. But what I'm hoping for is that we move beyond pockets to systemic change.
What a great place to end that. Eris, what a fantastic conversation with three wonderful people here.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
But the conversation never ends.
Yeah, it's got to keep going. I want to take a second to thank our three panelists here. Shelby, Joel, Trina, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. I want to thank everybody who took the time out of their day to come join us. Thank you for joining us. Eris, this was a blast. Thanks for joining me on here.
Yeah.
Excellent. And Stephanie, we throw it back to you.
Thank you so much. Co-sign the appreciation for each of our speakers, Dave, Eris, Trina, Shelby, Joel. Thank you so much. I'm hoping that I'm sharing my screen to share a couple of closing announcements. There we go. The video from today's session is going to be available in about a week, so please be on the lookout for that. We're going to post it to our YouTube channel as well. And we'd love to continue the conversation, so please join us for the final installment in our Future of Math series, where we're going to be talking about innovations in classroom technology and what that means for math teaching and learning in 2 weeks on May 9th. We also have some additional upcoming programming in May focused on mental health and wellness with a post-secondary lens, an arts impact group lens, and an out-of-school time lens. So please join us. And thank you again, everyone, for being here today.